Our gospel reading today, a young man we know from reading all three accounts. It's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This takes place just before Jesus starts to head towards Jerusalem. The next thing that's going to happen is he's going to go through Jericho, and you're going to have Zacchaeus, the wee little man, you know, the story up in a tree. That's the next thing that's going to happen. So he's on his way, right? He had just finished blessing the children. Little children coming to him, blessing the children. Disciples shooed them away, and Jesus rebuked his disciples, "Let the little children come to me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." And then this man runs up and kneels before him and says, "Good master, what can I do, or what good thing can I do to inherit the kingdom of heaven?" And Jesus, answering a question with a question, as often is the case. How many times have you asked Jesus for an answer and only got another question, right? Isn't that how often it is? "Why do you call me good? Think about what you're saying." I sometimes say that to people when they ask me, "Well, doesn't the scripture say, call no man father? Why do people call you father?" And I say, think about it. If the scripture says, call no man father, what are they saying if they call me father? Think about it, right? Jesus gave it back to him. "Why do you call me good? No one is good but the one God." And then he said, "Well, okay, keep the commandments." And then he goes through a list of, in Matthew he says which commandments, but in Mark and Luke, Jesus just goes through a list. And he gives the commandments that have to do with our relationships with one another, right? And then, of course, he summarizes it in Matthew with love your neighbor as yourself, which is the summary of the last 6 Ten Commandments, right? Remember the Sabbath, take care of your parents, don't steal, don't murder, don't covet, right? Don't bear false witness. All of these commandments are the commandments that have to do with our relationship with each other. He didn't mention any of the commandments that had to do with his relationship with God. It's kind of interesting. And of course, the reason he didn't is because that's the point. That's the point. The point is, you can do everything correctly on the horizontal level. You can do it all right on the horizontal level, but you're still lacking the one important thing, and that's the vertical, your relationship with God. I had to attend an ecumenical meeting. My bishop made me attend. I don't usually like going to those things, but I had to go to this one. And so I was, and it was good. It's good to talk. As our late patriarch used to say, when some people got upset about being involved with the World Council of Churches, he said, we have to at least talk to one another. So and so I went and we talked. So I had a great conversation with this guy from the Baha'i faith, Baha'i religion. And in the Baha'i religion, they believe that at the heart of everything, all religions are the same. At the center, they're all the same. And I would argue that most secular people think about that. But what I told this fellow from Baha'i was, that's interesting because we Orthodox Christians believe the opposite. That kind of on the surface level, religions are the same. But at the heart, they're very different. Yes, just about all religions say take care of your neighbor in one way or another. You know, don't sleep with someone unless you're going to commit the rest of your life to them. In one way or another, there are variations on the theme. But basically, all religions on this sort of surface, let's say horizontal level, are about the same. Right? I mean, certainly there are some better than others. But it's this vertical level, this who is God? And how do you relate to this God? That's where the differences are clear. Right? And that's what Jesus is pointing out to this fellow. It's not just about being a good person. Yes, it's good to be a good person. Go ahead, be a good person. We should all be good people. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is your relationship with God. Who is God? And how do you relate to him? And then Jesus sort of blew everybody's mind, because he said, okay, if you want to know what you're lacking, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, you'll have riches in heaven, and come and follow me. And the young man went away sad. And it says he went away sad because he had many possessions. But it doesn't end there. Our gospel reading didn't end with that. It goes on to say, when the disciples heard this, right? Well, first, okay, wait. He went away sad, and Jesus says how hard it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And his disciples, when they heard it, you know what it says of them? It says they were greatly amazed. Greatly amazed. And they said, well, then who can be saved? And Jesus ends with man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. By the way, where else did an angel say that? With man, this is impossible. But with, right? Mary says to Gabriel, I've not known a man. How can I conceive? With man, this is impossible. Thank you. But with God, all things are possible. So it's put on that level. Think about it, on that level. Now, this passage, Jesus saying, it's easier for a rich man, or it's harder, how did I say this? It's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of the needle, or it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to enter. This saying has really bothered Christians throughout the ages. And they've come up with lots of innovative explanations. Nobody really wants to stand with the disciples and be greatly amazed. We would rather explain it. Isn't that how it is in our life? Right? We confront something that greatly amazes us, and we want to explain it, instead of just being amazed. How can that be? The Mother of God, the angel comes to her and says, blessed are you among women. You're going to conceive the Messiah. How can that be? Oh, with man that's impossible. With God all things are possible. And what did she do? Did she say, like Zechariah, explain it to me? No, she said, let it be to me according to your word. It's impossible for men. It must be possible with God. Okay. But what do we do when we hear a word like, it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through an eye of a needle? We want to explain it. And so there's a couple of, you've probably heard these explanations before. Apparently there's a gate in Jerusalem called the Eye of Needle, which is very small, and a camel would have to take its burden off and go through on its knees in order to get through. And that's what he was talking about. Except that's not greatly amazing. If that's what he was talking about, why were the disciples greatly amazed? if that's what he was talking about, the disciples would say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I've seen that before. Right? But, right, yeah, oh, I'm with you, Jesus, we're tracking. Right? That's not what the disciples said. The disciples said they were greatly amazed. Then who can be saved? In fact, it's even entered the textual tradition of the Scripture. Some of the later manuscripts of Matthew have an added line where Jesus says how hard it is for a man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And then there's a line added in later manuscripts that says, where he repeats himself, how hard it is for a man who trusts in his riches to enter the kingdom of heaven. Right? Oh, that's what he meant. But if that's what he meant, why were the disciples greatly amazed? I mean, yeah, of course, if you trust in anything but God, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But no, the disciples were greatly amazed. And they said, who can be saved? Because the reality is, every person in this room is wealthy compared to somebody else. Right? We all have riches and possessions. And Jesus said how hard it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, who can be saved? With man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. Why is it that we have to be amazed? I'll tell you. Because this is not the only impossible thing we confront in our life. Most of us, if not right now, will very soon confront something in your life that is impossible. It's impossible to do this. It's impossible. Right? How can God create an Orthodox church where there wasn't one before? In the 21st century in British Columbia. Right? How is that possible? What's impossible for man is possible with God. Right? How can God fix my broken family? How can God provide for my needs? How can God get me a house in British Columbia where 2-bedroom condos go for $1.5 million? It's impossible for man. It is impossible for man. But what is impossible for man is possible for God. You see, this isn't just about going to heaven when you die. It's about how you live your whole life. It's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. It's impossible. I can't fix this thing. I can't make it work. No matter how hard I work, it won't happen. But with God, all things are possible. And so I think that's why we make a mistake when we try to explain away the saying of Jesus and to try to make it make sense. Because if our theology makes sense to us, then our theology won't apply very well in our actual life, because our actual life doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But if our theology is a theology of miracles, if our theology is a theology about a God who does what is impossible for us to do, then our theology applies directly and completely to our life. That's it. That's all I have to say. I ran out. God bless you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.